This video started out in my mind simply titled as, "No, the tank is not obsolete and stop saying it, you pejorative exclamation point." But since making the video version of the Batman meme felt a little thin, I took a broader view and arrived at the conclusion that World War III will be a trench war. A bold prediction, you say? Maybe. In fact, let me hurry up and slap on a qualifying note to my prediction and somewhat grand deviation from the original topic. The next Great War will either be decided in a couple of months at most, or drag on for half a decade. With the deciding factor being if all our fancy toys do what we think they will do, and the enemies don't, or we will both see our billion-dollar space-age tech crash and burn after having been hit by the modern war equivalent of a rock. This is a thought that has been rumbling around in my brain for quite some years now, and the events of Ukraine has further solidified it, as it shows the enormous difficulties inherent in attacking a near-parity nation with modern weapons. As millions and billions and trillions of dollars worth of equipment, tanks, IFVs, aircrafts, drone, artillery, etc., can all go up in smoke in a matter of minutes. But this does not mean that the equipment getting destroyed is necessarily obsolete. Rather, there is a different explanation for this. To illustrate the example using the tank question. Pretty much all of the dozens now of the tank is obsolete videos I've been sent by my friend, V in particular, seem to all pretty much revolve around the same central points. They start by saying, "Is the tank obsolete?" and then over the course of the video end up answering, "No." Because there simply is no currently available weapon system in service today that can do what the tank does, but better, safer, and more flexible. If we did, we'd be using that one, and until we invent literal Space Marine power armor, it is very unlikely that we will see that alternative. Simultaneously, simply getting rid of the tank is not an option. And instead of boring you with all the details and using 10-20 minutes on that, allow me to simply paint you a pretty little picture. What was the last major war we fought without tanks? That's right, World War I. How did that work out for everyone, particularly the infantry? Yes. The only real alternative to not having tanks is having hordes and hordes of infantry marching slowly into machine and autocannon fire, possibly protected by light-skinned and lightly armed IFVs and APCs. Yeah, it'd be an expensive war, let's just put it that way. Not to mention as well, what was it that finally ended World War I? That's right, the mass application of tanks. For better or worse, the tank has become a crucial and irreplaceable part of the modern battlefield. Yet, the wafer-thin justification for even asking the Cro-Magnon level question of whether or not the tank is obsolete always appears to be, the tank's totally getting destroyed by cheaper weapon systems, so this is stupid. The tank is obsolete? Okay, why? Because it gets destroyed by cheaper weapons. Alright. By that logic, the infantry, air force, and the navy are all obsolete. Why? Well, an infantryman costs tens of thousands of dollars to train and equip, and is killed by a bullet whose value is measured in cents. An F-35 will run you $100 million plus, and will get shot down by a $3 million missile system. An R.A. Burke-class destroyer costs a whopping $1.8 billion and can be sunk by a $2 million harpoon missile or a $4 million torpedo. This is not a tank issue, it is a lethality issue. Now, of course, it is impossible to draw precise parallels. A guided missile destroyer is not a tank in the same way a harpoon is not an ATGM. But the point nevertheless remains. Our swords have gotten so sharp that it has reduced our shields to little more than tattered, scattered remnants of wood strapped awkwardly to an arm. And this ancient allegory fits in perfectly today as well. Let us take the example of the Russian cope cages. Their effectiveness against a javelin is questionable at best, but it does raise the tank's profile by a solid 2 meters. Unfortunate indeed. Furthermore, it must be said that a lot of problems with the Russian tanks in particular can be explained simply by them being, well, Russian tanks. That ammo carousel for the autoloader is looking like a mighty bad idea right about now, isn't it? But, again, the problem here goes way beyond the tanks. Focusing on them is simply easier because they're big and noisy and pretty damn cool looking, and also have gotten a little bit of an undeserved reputation for being supposedly indestructible. But to focus entirely on the tank completely misses the bigger picture. Russia isn't failing because their tanks are getting destroyed, they are failing because every last one of their offensives have gotten shut down so hard it's turned into an internet meme. Ukrainian artillery is operating effectively despite the fact they should be getting detected and counter-battery to hell by newer and better Russian systems. Ukrainian AA is still claiming Russian aircraft and helicopters even though it should have been silenced in the first 24 hours of the invasion. And elite VDV airborne formations are getting chased off by National Guard troops. Now, of course, there are many possible reasons for this. There are many factors to take into consideration, several of which I've already discussed in detail, like logistics, communication, training, morale, etc., etc. But maybe, just maybe, this is a lot bigger of a thing than simple Russian incompetence. Maybe this is the first proper sign of a massive paradigm shift in modern warfare. And, of course, this would be nothing new. To return to the sword and the shield analogy, the race between the sword and the shield has been going on since the first Neanderthal brained the second with a heavy stick. And it has completely upended every commonly held perception of war again and again and again. The barbarian tribes of Gaul undoubtedly thought that they had this warfare thing pretty much figured out. They were massive, muscled brutes with long, heavy, crushing swords. And then a bunch of prissy-ass Italians with very large wooden planks showed up and completely ruffle-stomped them. Equally so, the French army of 1939 was quite convinced it had absorbed all the lessons of the Great War. No more massive casualties for them. Their hyper-advanced concrete bunkers and massive armoured tanks would crush the Germans and their silly little toy tanks. A thought that persisted all the way up until the point where the Horst Wessel was being played from the Eiffel Tower. But we don't even need to go that far back for a paradigm shift. The most modern example which shaped the current-day perception of warfare would be Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Everyone was so nervous about this war. The US commanders feared up to 20,000 casualties, maybe as many as 10,000 of those on the first day. But after pounding Iraq 6 ways to Sunday in a fashion so brutal as to make even the most veteran of wartime prostitutes faint, the total loss of life to Iraqi action was 147. To put that into perspective, the number of people that died during the invasion due to accidents was 145. Not since the first Aztec warrior saw his wooden and obsidian club shatter like a rotten log on a conquistador steel cuirass had the world seen such a genuinely unkind butt-fucking. It turned out that the Western arms industry had not merely outpaced their old adversaries, the Soviet Union, whose gear the Iraqi army was mostly equipped with, but had in fact reduced the Red Army's leftover stockpile to the relative equivalent of cum-soaked gummy bears. Mildly disturbing, to be sure, but rarely lethal. And this was all as a result of the West having spent the Cold War years hyping up every single piece of Russian engineering to superhuman levels, and initially, to some degree, there were reasons to be afraid. The Mi-24 Hind, for example, when it was first introduced, was completely and utterly superior to anything the West had, and the BMP an absolute monster when compared to the first Western IFVs. The heaviest gun we mounted on an IFV back then was a 20mm autocannon. The BMP-1 had a 73mm cannon plus anti-tank guided missiles. But by the 90s, as again evidenced by the Iraqi War, the roles had flipped completely. The Western sword had grown so sharp that it reduced the then fourth largest army in the world to dust and dirt, with the disdainful ease of a sadistic child frying ants with a magnifying glass. And by most reasonable estimations, the gap has only grown wider since then. But if this is true, why would it ever lead to a trench war? After all, if the Western powers are so hilariously superior, wouldn't they simply just destroy any opposition virtually overnight and roll on to victory? Well, in the case of a war against Russia, they very well might. And this returns us back to that if our toys do what we think they do and the enemies don't, we will end up with a very quick war. Because here's an interesting little thought. The Russians thought that their fancy toys would work as well. For example, the TB2 drone employed by the Ukrainians would have caused the Russians so much headache. It should not, theoretically, be doing what it's doing. This is a point that I, and myself, and many others have brought up again and again, and it's not like Russia was unaware of the TB2. In fact, they designed specific countermeasures against it, like the repellent system. This is an electronic warfare system which the Russians said would be able to detect a TB2 from 20 to 30 kilometers away, jam it, and force it to ram itself into the ground, at best case scenario for the Russians, or force it to return to base, if not. If this system had functioned like the Russians thought it would function, each and every one of these repellents would create a 30-kilometer bubble into which no Ukrainian UAV could fly. And of course, the system would not be operating in isolation. It would be functioning alongside radar systems and AA systems, like the Russian Pantsir. This weapon system is also theoretically supposed to be able to detect a TB2 drone from 20 to 30 kilometers and engage and destroy it in a range of 15 to 20 kilometers. Operating together in a network, these various weapon systems should be able to cover huge portions of the front line with relative ease, whilst also being able to engage and destroy those dreaded drones. But, as countless videos seemingly recorded from drones destroying Russian vehicles and straight-up AA systems seems to indicate, something else has happened. To break this down from a hyper-complicated issue to an extraordinarily oversimplified one, the fancy Russian toys didn't do what the Russians thought they would do, but the fancy Ukrainian toys did do what they thought they would do. And think about the advantage that this gives Ukraine. Being able to operate those drones allows them to observe the enemy's supply convoys. It allows them to observe their routes of approach. It allows them to effectively attack supply convoys, tanks, AA systems, and artillery systems. It also allows them to use these drones as advanced artillery spotters, guiding in lethally precise artillery ammunition without the need for any range finding, which allows the Ukrainian guns, many of which are of much older types than those used by the Russians, to simply elevate their weapons, pound off a few rounds, and then scoot the hell on out of there before the more advanced Russian counter-battery can detect the fire and guide its own rounds onto the Ukrainian artillery. Not to mention, of course, the myriad other obvious advantages that the defender will have when they can observe the enemy at will, with very little, if damn near any, risk to themselves. To boil it down, whilst of course there are many other factors at play here, the fact that one fancy toy worked and the other didn't has granted an enormous advantage to one side. Because again, our swords are very sharp, but our shields, our ability to defend ourselves, here represented by the repellent and the panzer, appear to simply not be up to the task. But of course, Russia is just an example used here. Russia has not been a true competitor to the West for decades at this point. But there is someone who might be. There is someone that the US Army is gearing up to fight right now. There is someone whom the US Army has transformed an entire branch of its army specifically to counter, the US Marine Corps, in case you're wondering, and that is China. And it has been sharpening its swords for a very long time as well. Let me give you an example here. This is the PL-15 air-to-air missile. As the designation suggests, its job is to shoot down other aircraft. It entered service in 2016 and has a reported top speed of Mach 4.5 and a maximum range of 300 kilometers. The rough equivalent to this over here in the West is the American-made AIM-120 AMRAAM, or Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile. The most common variant entered service in the early 90s and flies at a speed of Mach 4 with a range of circa 40 nautical miles or 75 kilometers. Meaning that not only is the AMRAAM slower than the PL-15, it has less than a third of the range. And even the most modern long-range variants of the AIM-120, the D variant, has just a smidge over half the range of the PL-15. Now, obviously, before we all start ringing the alarm bells, as we are so very used to over here in the West, just because you can fire a missile at 300 kilometers doesn't mean that you would want to, or that it would be at all effective at that range. Indeed, against modern US fighters like the F-22 or the 35, the PL-15's superior range would be absolutely useless in all due likelihood, as by the time the PL-15's aircraft, its weapon platform, actually detects the US fighters, they would be well within range of their own weapons. Assuming, of course, that our fancy toys, our stealth systems, work, and their fancy toys, their radars, don't. As otherwise, the PL-15 could be an absolute nightmare to deal with, as it would allow Chinese aircraft to unload their entire payload of anti-air missiles, and then just turn around and fly away long before the opposition planes are anywhere even remotely close to being able to retaliate. And one should also remember that the main target of things like the PL-15 and the hyper-experimental, super long-range hypersonic missile the Chinese claim to be perfecting right now, with a supposed speed of Mach 6 and a range of 500 to 600 kilometers, would mainly be aimed towards large and considerably less maneuverable assets, like AWACS or ELINT or air-to-air refueling tankers. Assets that will all be absolutely invaluable to the US's ability to fight a war against China near, say, Little Island, for example. Now again, I'd like to stress that it's a very big if any of the Chinese Wunderwaffens will actually function the way that the Chinese think or claim that they will. The Dongfeng 26 IRBM is another example of this. It has the range they claim to reach all the way to the US bases in Guam with conventional warheads. It's also supposed to have some kind of hyper-advanced specialized warhead able to detect a US carrier group and attack the carrier specifically at a range of several thousand kilometers by detaching from the main IRBM rocket somewhere high above and then sniffing out the carrier and guiding itself directly onto target. It sounds awfully science fiction-y, and to the best of my knowledge, the Chinese have never actually even claimed that they've successfully tested it against a ocean-going target, but, oh well, details. But what happens if both sides' swords are equally sharp? What if neither side can gain air superiority, because even their most high-tech aircraft are getting shot down by the dozens by very cheap and simple-to-produce anti-air missiles? Relatively speaking, at least, to modern-day jet fighters. What happens when no precision strike bombing runs can be carried out, no close air support is available, seed operations become next to impossible because you can't wrest complete air superiority from the enemy, enemy anti-air grows ever more frequent and effective because you can't carry out good seed, spying operations become virtually impossible, UAVs, spy planes and ELINTs get shot down as well by very long-range anti-air missiles. That's actually a technical term, by the way. VLRAAM. A very long-range anti-air missile. It sounds like something a fifth grader would come up with, but no, it is actually a real thing. But what happens then? Well, we're going to be seeing a bit of a cascade effect, because up until now, air power has been one of the biggest deciding factors because Western seed operations have grown so effective as to allow the intrusion into virtually any airspace. So long as air superiority can be wrested with superior air-to-air missiles, then ground defenses have grown remarkably impotent. Even the hyper-advanced air defenses like the Russian S-300 and S-400 batteries have not performed particularly well in Ukraine. Or at least so it seems from the available information we have right now. But the point is, air power has been in a position where it has been able to kill almost anything and everything else, both due to its ability to carry very effective weaponries at very high altitudes and strike from a, well, incredibly advantageous position. High ground has always been an advantage in modern warfare, in ancient warfare, and in Star Wars, I suppose. And not even just as a weapon delivery location, but as a way to spy on the enemy. If we remove all of this, we take it one step down, where armored vehicles are being engaged by ATGMs and being destroyed very easily by weapon systems that are very cheap by comparison. Okay, what do we do then? Well, we can move one step further down, where infantry are also being destroyed by advanced weapon systems like artillery shells, which cost virtually nothing and are fired by launchers far behind the front line, now almost entirely safe due to the lack of enemy air to detect them, to engage them, or to guide in other fire. Bearing in mind as well that one of the best ways to avoid getting your infantry smacked into the ground by overwhelming enemy artillery was simply to not be where the artillery was landing. But with armored fighting vehicles and APCs getting blown up by the dozens with absolute ease from ridiculous long distances by ATGMs, that's another advantage that's going to be disappearing awfully quickly. Simultaneously, the artillery, as we know from World War I and World War II, is super fancy and can turn an offensive into a grinding bloody mess in mere minutes, but it never performs particularly well against entrenched positions. To illustrate this, we can see an example from the Second World War, the Battle of the Seelow Heights outside of Berlin. The Russians brought some 9,000 artillery pieces. They fired 500,000 shells in the first 30 minutes of the bombardment. They would end up firing millions of shells at the German positions. This is far more artillery firepower than any entire army could bring to bear today, and yet, when the Russians advanced, they found the Germans still in their positions, ready to continue fighting. Ironically, this is one of fairly few areas in which our swords have not outraced our shields. At least not to the level where it would become an automatic victory. Oh, artillery can absolutely destroy serious areas of front line. We have examples, again from World War II, of Russian massed artillery straight up annihilating entire trench lines, wiping out front areas, only to have them be retaken again by German counterattacks from a line 500 meters to the rear, after repelling the Russian assault, which ran into, again, the second line 500 meters to the rear. Which brings us to another very interesting point, which will further hammer home the trench war. Modern-day armored vehicles, modern-day tanks, modern-day artillery, etc. are very, very, very good. Incredibly good, in fact, unbelievably good by the standards of just 60, 70 years ago. But they are also much, 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 much rarer. For example, the United States Army in total on all variants has somewhere along the lines of 8,000 to 9,000 Abrams main battle tanks. By comparison, during World War II, the Soviet Army produced 84,000 of the two main variants, the 76 and the 85. If we were to look at aircraft, the US Air Force right now has about 1,355 fighters, by the best estimate I could find. During World War II, Germany produced over 53,000 fighters over the course of the war. Now, to be clear, those 10,000 odd Abrams could probably destroy all 80,000 plus T-34s with no problems. The point I'm making is, these weapons, our modern weapons, are far rarer, slower to produce, and more difficult to replace. Meaning that if we start getting into a trench war where the defender will have an enormous defensive advantage, losses will begin to rise in percentages extraordinarily quickly. And unless those defenses can be broken open just as quickly, then the percentage losses will rise and rise at a meteoric speed, until very soon the various commanders will realize, holy hell, I'm burning billions of dollars of hardware every time I try to do anything. This rate of loss is not sustainable. Look at Russia now, for example. If the Ukrainian estimates are accurate, which, to be fair, they probably aren't, then Russia has burnt through perhaps a tenth of their entire armored forces in a month. It's obviously not going to work in the long run. And very soon, therefore, commanders will start thinking, I'm not going to risk this ludicrously expensive piece of hardware on this mission. I'm not going to send in $100 million F-35 on a bombing run or a strike run. Instead, these hyper-modern systems will be hoarded. They will be kept nice and safe and used only in massive, prepared operations. Kinda like the German idea in World War I of the Sturmtruppen. Of course, again, it's certainly no one-to-one comparison, but manpower was growing awfully rare in Germany at the time, and offensive pushing power capable of breaking open a part of the front line was even rarer still. But Germany had seen significant success utilizing heavily armed and specialized infantry formations, the stormtroopers, to attack enemy positions using specialized weapons and specialized tactics to take over and burst open areas of the front line. These troopers were not kept in the frontline trenches like the regular soldiers. They were instead hoarded as a precious resource. They were kept nice and far behind the front line, relatively safe. They were valuable due to the relative scarcity of men of their caliber, training, and specialization, and only brought forward during major operations. Or when desperation called, I do suppose. In this hypothetical scenario, as the losses of the hyper-advanced stuff begins rising, and the hoarding begins, there will however be a need to replace them with cheaper alternatives. The sword will begin to dull. We will start using simpler UAVs in trade for the hyper-advanced close air support. We will start using more dumb munition. We might even start using UAVs as suicide bombs, as we have already seen in certain weapon systems, instead of using hyper-advanced missiles. We might start using remote-controlled tanks, little more than big fancy boxes with a radar antenna and a gun on it, instead of tanks. Or we might start employing easier-to-produce IFVs as frontline fighting vehicles, even though they're going to get destroyed in ridiculous numbers. And ironically, this will in turn only increase the stalemate to begin with, as cheaper weapon systems will mean that we will have more weapon systems. Conscription will begin kicking in, more troops will be reaching the front line with lower and lower levels of training, as both sides are rushing to fill in gaps or try to outflank their enemies. Front lines will swiftly begin to swell and grow wider and wider and wider, but the fear of casualties will of course require digging in. Even as more and more weapon systems are created, built, and shoved off to the front line, they will become less and less hyper-advanced due to the cost concerns. Because again, you can only sacrifice tanks to ATGMs for so long. That is absolutely a point that the tanks are obsolete silly videos do have. But instead of this meaning that a single weapon system is somehow falling out of favor or is somehow obsolete, I instead believe that it is, again, representative of the wider arms race, which, when it does turn around, it will be a very, very, very shitty war. Though, it might also be our last human war. We're entering into some real science fiction here, but if we do get another grinding conflict like World War I, well, our technology is approaching the level now that maybe human soldiers are no longer the most effort and cost-effective ways of waging war. It takes a long time to train even a grunt rifle infantryman, after all. Whereas beep boop, considerably quicker. But that is a very different topic for perhaps another time. For now, I'm gonna wrap this one up and ask you for some feedback. What do you think about this one? This is rather high-flying, I know, and it does represent a very outlier scenario in which neither side is able to gain a decisive advantage, yet at the same time, with our weapon systems getting so goddamn good, and with the number of weapon systems also decreasing, you don't need that many PL-15s to hit before the US Air Force starts getting awfully nervous about deploying any of its nice, expensive F-35s. And maybe we'll start sending up older models, which will be lost in larger numbers, even as they in turn shoot down probably more Chinese aircraft who will also start going, the loss of the J-20s is getting a bit annoying here. Maybe we should start sending up more of our F-16 rip-offs and so on and so on. I do believe it is not a completely insane hypothesis, unlike the tanks are obsolete one anyways. Anywho, let me know what you thought in the comment section down below, and as always, if you did enjoy the video, please do consider leaving a comment and a like. That's what the YouTube algorithm enjoys. Until next time, I've been Arch, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.